We rarely notice how complete the world appears until we pause long enough to feel the weight of that completeness. A table is a table. A stone is a stone. A body occupies space. A star burns across the dark. Every object seems to announce its own reality with quiet certainty. The universe, at first glance, feels like a finished structure. Solid, measurable, independent. It seems to stand there on its own, as if matter were the obvious beginning of everything. That assumption is so familiar that it usually goes unexamined. We are taught to trust what can be measured. We describe mass, charge, momentum, fields, radiation. We map the behavior of particles and the geometry of space. We build instruments that can detect what the eye cannot see. And from all of this, a simple picture seems to emerge. First there is matter. Then there is life. And only much later, in some complicated biological arrangement, consciousness appears. It is an elegant story. It has the comfort of sequence. Yet there is a strange weakness inside that comfort. Because the more carefully we look at reality, the less it resembles a pile of self-existing objects. It begins to resemble a system. Not merely a collection of things, but an ordered environment in which things appear, interact, persist, and vanish according to rules that are not visible in the objects themselves. A chair does not explain the room. A molecule does not explain the law that allows it to behave as it does. A planet does not explain the mathematics that describes its orbit. The visible world may be real, but it may not be primary. What if matter is not the base layer at all? What if it is only the furniture inside a deeper condition, something arranged within a larger operating space that we mistake for the whole of reality because it is the only part we can touch directly? This is not a religious claim. It does not ask for belief. It asks for a more careful kind of attention. When we say that matter is fundamental, we usually mean that it exists first and explains the rest. But perhaps matter is what reality looks like after something deeper has already begun working. Perhaps the world of solid things is not the source code, but the visible result of a hidden process. And if that is even possible, then the question changes shape. Consciousness is usually treated as a late arrival, a flicker produced by complex brains in a universe that did not need it. Yet there is another way to frame the same scene. Perhaps consciousness is not the passenger of reality. Perhaps it is the condition under which reality becomes legible at all. Perhaps it is not a decorative feature added at the end, but the deeper field from which the appearance of matter is generated. The idea is unsettling only because it reverses the order we have inherited. We are used to thinking of the mind as something that watches the universe from inside a body. But what if the body, the brain, and the measurable world are all elements inside a more fundamental process, one that is not made of matter in the usual sense, but gives rise to matter as one of its outputs? Then the world does not disappear. It becomes more mysterious, not less. Its solidity remains. Its laws remain. Its precision remains. Yet all of it begins to look less like the bottom of existence and more like a carefully maintained surface, a visible layer resting on something deeper, quieter, and far less obvious. If that assumption begins to wobble, the next question is simple. What exactly are matter, energy, and magnetism if they are not the foundation? There is a certain comfort in how physics names its elements. Matter, antimatter, energy, magnetism. Each feels like a discrete, tangible entity, a building block in the architecture of existence. We imagine them as the stones from which the universe is laid, the hard scaffolding beneath all that is soft, shifting, or conscious. But if we step back, quietly, and listen to the world as it is, not as we expect it to be, something subtle emerges. What if these categories are not the foundation, but only the furnishings inside a much larger and stranger room? Consider matter. At first glance, it is the most obvious, the most reassuring. The chair beneath you, the air in your lungs, the planet itself. Each seems to declare its own independent reality. Matter is measurable, weighty, apparently self-contained. Yet, as physics has advanced, the boundaries of matter have blurred. At atomic and subatomic scales, solidity dissolves. Particles flicker in and out of existence, governed less by location than by probability, more by relation than by essence. The closer we look, the less matter behaves as a thing in itself and the more it resembles a stable pattern, a persistent appearance shaped by underlying rules. It is as if the universe is less a pile of rocks and more a choreography, matter as a recurring motif in a larger, unseen music. Antimatter, when it enters the scene, deepens the strangeness. For every particle of matter, there exists a mirror. Anti-electrons, anti-protons, anti-neutrons. Their existence is not a surplus, but a necessity, a kind of symmetry embedded within the system. When matter and antimatter meet, they annihilate, vanishing in a burst of energy, as if their reality was always conditional, always held in delicate balance. Antimatter is not an exotic supplement. It is a reminder that what we call real is already entangled with its own negation. It is the back of the tapestry, the shadow that gives the pattern its edge. In this view, both matter and antimatter appear as outputs of a deeper logic, their dance more fundamental than either alone. Energy is subtler still. It is not a thing, but a relation, a measure of change, of possibility, of transformation. We track it as heat, as motion, as potential. But energy never stands alone. It is always in transit, always the difference between states, the currency of exchange between what is and what might be. Physics can measure it, account for it, harness it, yet it cannot point to energy as an object. It is a behavior, not a substance, a verb, not a noun. The more we pursue energy, the more it slips into the background, a signal that the real engine of the world is not in the things themselves, but in the process that unfolds between them. Magnetism is perhaps the most ghostly of all. Invisible, yet unyielding. It shapes the motion of particles, the structure of galaxies, the flicker of auroras at the edge of our sky. A field, not a thing. Even the word field suggests something spread out, something that belongs not to the objects in it, but to the space itself. Magnetism is a condition, an influence, a patterning of forces that gives matter its behavior but does not explain its existence. It is the echo of a rule, the demonstration of a law, but not the source of law itself. Taken together, these familiar terms, matter, antimatter, energy, magnetism, begin to feel less like foundational strata and more like appearances, outputs of a deeper process. They are the furniture inside the room, arranged in forms that seem stable only because we live among them. They are what the system produces when it is running, not what the system is made of. Physical theories, in this light, become descriptions of the room's arrangement, not instructions for building the room itself. This inversion is not a rejection of physics, but a quiet reframing. It is possible to hold physics as true within its domain, every measurement, every equation, every experiment, while also suspecting that these truths are the products of a more fundamental operating condition. Like shadows cast on a wall, they are real within the play of light, but their source lies elsewhere, beyond the reach of direct measurement. It is tempting to ask, if matter and its kin are outputs, then what is the process that generates them? What is the room in which this furniture is arranged? The metaphors of software and hardware become unavoidable. Matter as interface, energy as computation, the laws of physics as code running on an unknown substrate. In this framing, the universe does not consist of things, but of events, a continuous unfolding whose visible elements are only the most stable, the most repeatable, the most measurable. The true base layer, whatever it is, remains hidden, its nature inferred only by the regularity and coherence of what it produces. Perhaps this is why the deepest equations of physics, those that describe the vacuum, the quantum fields, the curvature of space, never quite pin down what exists. They describe relations, transformations, probabilities, but never a final, irreducible thing. Each answer opens a new question, each layer of description reveals another layer beneath. It is as if the universe protects its own source code, allowing only the compiled outputs to be observed. Once these familiar elements are moved out of the foundation, the deeper question becomes unavoidable. What kind of reality is producing them? There is a certain strangeness in the idea that consciousness might be more fundamental than the matter and energy it seems to inhabit. For most of history, the order of explanation has run one way. The world is made of particles. Those particles assemble into atoms, atoms into molecules, molecules into cells, And somewhere far along this chain, awareness flickers into being as a kind of accidental byproduct, a shadow cast by the machinery of physics. But what if this order is reversed? What if, instead of consciousness emerging from a world of matter, matter itself is something that emerges inside a field of consciousness? Not as a point of religious faith, nor as poetic metaphor, but as a disciplined hypothesis about what reality is equipped to generate at its deepest level. Pause for a moment and let this inversion settle. Imagine the familiar world, tables, stones, the beating of your own heart, as objects inside a simulation. The simulation is not running on silicon, but in a medium more primary than particles or waves. That medium is awareness itself, not the personal awareness of an individual mind, but the raw capacity for experience, the possibility for things to appear. This is not the consciousness we associate with thoughts, language, or self-reflection. It is not the mind of a person, nor the soul of a creature. It is the fundamental background condition that allows anything to be present at all. In philosophical language, it is not a property of things, but the ground in which properties appear. There is a certain rigor in approaching consciousness in this way. It is not the assertion of a mystical force, nor an appeal to the unknowable. Instead, it is the recognition that all our models, physics, chemistry, the laws of motion, are descriptions of relationships between appearances, and every appearance is, in the most basic sense, an item in consciousness. Consider the act of measuring the spin of an electron. The electron does not have a definite spin until it is observed. This is not simply a feature of human ignorance, but a formal element of quantum mechanics itself. The act of observation is not the same as a human looking. It is any interaction that produces a definite outcome. But that outcome always shows up within some form of awareness, even if that awareness is not personal or biological. What if it is not the measuring device, nor the particle, that is fundamental, but the capacity for a result to be experienced? What if the universe is not a dead machine occasionally producing sparks of mind, but a field of consciousness occasionally producing sparks of matter? This line of thinking does not ask us to abandon the findings of physics. It asks us to invert their order. Particles, fields, magnetism, gravity, these are not the bedrock, but the patterns that emerge when consciousness runs certain algorithms. The laws of nature are the rules of the simulation, but the operating system is consciousness itself. In this model, matter is a process, not a substance. The electron, the proton, the quark are not lumps of stuff, but stable excitations, patterns within a deeper field. And that field is not the electromagnetic vacuum or quantum foam, but the possibility for pattern at all, the capacity for being. This is a move from description to condition. Physics describes what happens when certain rules are in play. But for rules to run, for any interaction to occur, there must first be a stage on which they are enacted. The stage is consciousness, not as a personal experience, but as the basic environment in which anything can happen. Such a view does not solve all the puzzles of physics, but it does recast them. The question is no longer, how does matter produce awareness? But, how does awareness produce the appearance of matter? The focus shifts from the building blocks to the builder, from the furniture to the room, from the objects to the operating system. This is not an argument against physics, but an attempt to locate physics within a larger context. Mathematics becomes the code, the script that consciousness runs. The laws of conservation, the symmetry of space and time, the constants and variables, all are routines within a larger operating environment. The most radical implication is that the universe is not a thing, but a process within consciousness. Reality is not a static collection of objects, but the ongoing result of awareness running its own simulation. The familiar solidity of matter is a persistent pattern, not a foundation. It may seem that this is a step into uncertainty, a retreat from the clarity of science. But in truth, it is a demand for greater clarity. If physics is to explain the appearance of things, it must also account for the fact that things appear at all. The old model leaves consciousness as an anomaly, a latecomer. The new model makes it the base layer, the condition for the possibility of any world. Perhaps this is not the answer, but the next necessary question. If consciousness is the operating layer, then the next puzzle is where the rules of interaction are actually placed. We rarely notice the background of things, the silent space between objects, the stillness in a room after everyone leaves. To the eye, to the hand, to our instruments, the vacuum seems like nothing at all. An emptiness waiting to be filled. But emptiness is a strange concept. It is not the absence of everything, but the absence of what we expect to find. Physics, for a long time, treated the vacuum as a kind of neutral zero. A blank slate, a stage with no actors, no props, no scenery, just a place where things might someday appear. In the old Newtonian scheme, space was infinite emptiness, and matter existed against it like islands in a dark ocean. The vacuum was passive, inert, and forgettable. But as the 20th century unfolded, that picture began to fracture. Quantum field theory arrived, and with it, the realization that what we call empty space is not empty at all. It seethes with virtual particles, flickering in and out of existence. It hums with zero-point energy, a restless undercurrent that cannot be drained away. The vacuum is not a silence, but a background noise so deep and subtle that only the most sensitive instruments can detect its hints. Sometimes, a particle appears out of nothing, an electron here, a positron there, briefly borrowing energy from the vacuum itself, only to vanish again before the universe notices the debt. The Casimir effect, observed in the laboratory, shows that two metal plates placed close together in a vacuum feel a force pulling them together, not because of any visible agent, but because the vacuum between them is different from the vacuum outside. Even nothingness, it turns out, has structure. It is tempting to think of this as a technical correction, a footnote to our grander theories. But what if this is the main story? What if the vacuum is not simply the absence of content, but the environment that allows content to exist at all? Imagine a computer, powered on but waiting for instructions. The screen is black, the memory is empty, but the operating system is present. This is not nothing, it is a readiness, a prepared potential. The vacuum, in this analogy, is not a void, but the operating environment in which the rules of the game are installed. In this sense, the vacuum is not a passive container, but an active platform. It defines what can appear, what can interact, what can be. It is not the stage, but the operating system upon which the play of physics unfolds. What we call the laws of nature, the symmetries, the constants, the mathematical relationships, are not floating in the abstract. They are instantiated, loaded, made real within this environment. The vacuum is the medium that holds the rules, and the rules are what shape what we perceive as matter, energy, and all the rest. There are hints of this everywhere, if you look. The speed of light is not just a number, it is a property of the vacuum itself. Change the environment, and the rules change with it. In a block of glass, light slows down, not because the photon loses energy, but because the environment redefines what is possible. The vacuum, too, sets the limit. The fine structure constant, the strengths of the forces, the very shape of space-time. These are not imposed from outside, but are properties of the vacuum as it is. Physicists sometimes speak of the false vacuum, a state where the background conditions are not at their lowest possible energy, but are stable enough for a universe to exist. If the vacuum were to change, if the rules were to shift, everything we know would dissolve instantly, replaced by something else. The vacuum is not the background of reality. It is the environment in which reality is possible. And if we return for a moment to the earlier thread, that consciousness is not some latecomer, but the operating layer beneath all else, the image grows stranger still. The vacuum, then, is not simply an empty space, but the field in which the laws of experience are instantiated. It is the loaded environment, the platform upon which the algorithm of existence is run. In ordinary life, we do not see this. We move through rooms and streets, noticing objects, not the space between them. We measure particles and fields, not the readiness out of which they emerge. But every measurement, every observation, every act of perception unfolds within an environment already primed with possibility. The vacuum is not a nothingness, but a fullness of potential, a loaded system, holding the conditions for what can arise. It is possible, then, that what we call emptiness is the most active thing of all. That the vacuum is not a void, but the fertile ground in which the laws of reality are installed, ready to generate phenomena whenever the right operation is called. The unsettling thought is not that there is nothing beneath things, but that nothing is itself the operating environment, preloaded and waiting. And if the vacuum is the environment, then something must be doing the loading. There is a certain comfort in the predictability of reality. We trust that water will freeze at a certain temperature, that the planets will orbit the sun in smooth ellipses, that the same experiment, repeated anywhere in the universe, will yield the same outcome. The world is readable, not just patterned, but lawful, as if reality itself is built atop some universal logic, written in the language of mathematics. For centuries, this trust has been the bedrock of science. We describe what we see with equations. We discover laws, Maxwell's equations, Newton's laws, Einstein's field equations, and we come to believe that these are not merely human inventions, but windows into a deeper order that was there all along. The laws are treated as eternal, absolute, inhabiting a realm beyond time and space, dictating what may and may not occur. But there is a strangeness in this clarity, a quiet question that rarely surfaces. Why should the universe be so thoroughly mathematical? Why should everything from the orbit of a moon to the spectrum of a hydrogen atom submit so precisely to lines of human-written code? Why does the world not only behave, but behave as if it is running a script? It is tempting to imagine that mathematics is the skeleton of reality, the structure on which all else hangs. But perhaps this is only half the story. Perhaps mathematics is not the ultimate cause, but the operating logic that is loaded into the system. Not an external commandment, but an internal algorithm. The laws do not precede the environment, they are instantiated within it. Imagine for a moment that the universe is not a book written in the language of mathematics, but a running process. The laws are not outside, but inside, active, ongoing, executed at every moment. In this view, mathematics is not an abstract Platonic realm, but the code that reality's operating system reads and rereads, line by line, tick by tick. Patterns are not etched into some eternal stone. They are constantly generated, maintained, and updated, like a simulation that keeps itself coherent by running its own rules. The feeling of lawfulness, then, is not the mark of a universe governed from afar, but the signature of a system that is intrinsically lawful because it is running lawful code. The laws of physics are not commandments handed down to matter and energy. They are the protocols by which the sandbox is maintained. The constants and equations are not the bricks, but the instructions for arranging the bricks. Change the code, and the universe unfolds differently. This is why the vacuum, as we explored earlier, cannot be thought of as mere absence. It is the loaded environment, the runtime. It is where the code of mathematics is instantiated, where the protocols of interaction are not simply possible but actively enforced. The vacuum is not empty space. It is the space in which the code is loaded and executed. The laws are not floating above the universe. They are what is running inside it. This perspective also reframes the mystery of the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. It is not that mathematics magically corresponds to reality, but that reality is what happens when mathematics is loaded as executable code. When we find equations that describe the universe, we are not discovering the mind of God or the deepest truth of existence. We are reverse engineering the operating instructions of the system itself. The code is not out there, waiting to be found. It is in here, sustaining every interaction, every field, every particle. If this is true, then the universality of the laws, the fact that they work everywhere and everyone, is not a cosmic coincidence, but a reflection of the system's architecture. The sandbox is loaded with the same code, no matter where you look. The constants are not arbitrary, they are parameters set at runtime. Physics is not a set of rules imposed from the outside, but a set of processes unfolding from within. This vision is at once more intimate and more unsettling. It means that the universe is not just lawful, but actively lawing. The rules are not static, they are alive, enacted moment by moment. The fabric of reality is not a canvas on which laws are painted, but a living environment in which the logic is always running, always generating, always sustaining. And yet, this model shifts the question to a new domain. If the laws are loaded, if the code is running, Then where does the loading happen? What is the substrate, the engine, the hardware on which this process unfolds? If the vacuum is the operating environment, what powers it? What starts the code? What maintains its execution? What endows it with the capacity to sustain a lawful, readable universe at all? We are left, once again, at the edge of familiarity. The laws are less like commandments carved in stone and more like instructions that must be constantly interpreted and enforced. The universe is less like a cathedral built according to a blueprint, and more like a living system, running its code, maintaining its own conditions of existence. And if mathematics is code, then the next question is not what the laws are, but who or what loads them. What is the deeper substrate, the root system, the engine that makes lawfulness possible? If we follow this thread, we find ourselves drawn toward the possibility that all of the familiar, matter, energy, law, structure, are not the foundation, but what is generated when the code is read and run. The question becomes, what kind of engine could sustain such a loaded environment at all? If there is hardware, then the sandbox it generates becomes the next layer to examine. Consider the paradox that arises. In the traditional view, we are made of matter, and that matter is unconscious. Our thoughts, our sense of self, are byproducts of neural circuits, which are themselves arrangements of molecules, which are themselves patterns in fields. But if consciousness is the base layer, then what we call physical is already imbued with the potential for awareness. Not as a mystical property, but as a logical outcome of a system whose ground state is the capacity to experience. A self-aware system does not merely produce static images of itself. It produces changing, dynamic patterns, streams of experience, each one unique, each one carrying a trace of the whole. In this sense, the appearance of conscious life is not a puzzle to be explained away, but the signature of the system accomplishing its most fundamental operation, becoming visible to itself in countless forms. Imagine a mirror not made of glass but of processes. Every mind, every locus of awareness, is a reflection, partial, fleeting, of the totality. Reality, in this model, is not a stage upon which minds appear as actors. Minds are folds in the stage itself. Experience is the system's way of touching its own boundaries, testing its own structure, feeling its own edges. And if this is so, then the distinction between subject and object, between observer and observed, is not absolute. It is a functional split, a necessary illusion for the unfolding of experience. The system creates boundaries, skins, shells, containers, not to separate, but to allow for the play of perspective. Each eye is a window through which the universe gazes out at itself, discovering its own potentialities. There is a peculiar humility in this view. It does not elevate human minds to the center, nor does it reduce them to accidents. It suggests that awareness is a property of reality at its root, and that every act of perception, every moment of self-reflection, is reality experimenting with its own possibilities.